King KAMBUF, 1804, Haiti massacre, www.kambuf.com. In 1804, Haiti massacre was carried out against the remaining French population in Haiti at the end of the Haiti Revolution by soldiers, most former slaves, under orders of Jean-Jacques Dessalines from the early days, January 1804 until 22nd April 04. Squads of soldiers moved from house to house throughout Haiti, torturing and killing entire families. Between 3,000 to 5,000 people were killed. 1804, Haiti massacre hills. Location, First Empire of Haiti. January 1804, April 1804, 218 years ago. The French people were the target. There was about 3,000 to 5,000 deaths. The perpetrators was the army of Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Nicholas A. Robbins and Adam Jones theorized that the executions were a genocide of a subaltern and an oppressed group used genocide means to destroy its oppressors. Other scholars have suggested that the threat of the reinvasion and the reinstatement of slavery as a reason for the massacre. Throughout the early to mid-19th century, the events of the massacre were well known in the United States. Additionally, many Saint Dominican refugees moved to Saint Domingo to the U.S., settling in New Orleans and Charleston, New York, Baltimore, and other coastal cities. These events spurred fears of potential uprisings in the southern United States, and they were polarized by the public opinion on the question of the abolition of the sin of slavery. Background: slavery, hence Christopher's person, secretary, who was the slave for much of his life, we see, attempted to explain the incident by referencing the cruel treatment of black slaves by white slaveholders in Saint Domingo. Have they not hung up men with the heads downward drawn, them in sacks, crucified them on planks, buried them alive, crushed them with mortars? Have they not forced them and consumed feces? Have they not flayed them with the lashes, I say? Have they not cast them alive into devouring worms, or unto anthills, or lashed them in stakes in the swamps and devoured them by mosquitoes, having them thrown? They were boiled conundrums of cane served. Have they not put the women inside barrels, stubborn with spikes, and rolled them down mountainsides into the abyss? Have they not co-signed this miserable black to the man-eating dogs until this, the later stated, by the human flesh, left unto mangled victims to be finished off with the bayonets and baynards? The Haiti Revolution, burning of the Plain de Capri, massacre of whites by blacks on August 22nd, 1791. Slaves set fire to plantations, torched cities, and massacred the whole white population. In 1791, a man of Jamaican origin named Dudu Bakaman became the leader of the enslaved nation of Africans held on a large plantation in Cape Francis. In the wake of the French Revolution, he planned to massacre all French living in Cape Francis on August 22nd, 1791. The enslaved Africans descended on Lake Cap Pitotopon, where they destroyed the plantation and executed all the French who lived in the fucking region. King Louis the fucking 16th was accused of the indifference to the massacre, while the slaves seemed to think the king was on their side. In July 17, 1993, The French and the Grayskleys were massacred despite the French proclamation of emancipation. The blacks sided with the Spanish who were occupying the region. In July 1794, Spanish forces stood by while the black troops of James Francis massacred the French whites. Philip Garner's right and genocide was openly considered a tragedy by both sides in the conflict. White forces sent by Napoleon Bonaparte committed massacres but were defeated before they could accomplish genocide, while the army under Jean-Luc Dantès, composed mainly of former slaves, was able to wipe out the white Haitian population. We see Garner describes 5 main factors leading to the massacre, we see, which he describes as the genocide. Haitian soldiers were influenced by the Kurd ideology. Grounds to economic interest motivated French planters to want to quell the uprisings, and the influencing former slaves to want to kill the planters and take ownership of the plantations. The slaves revolted, being ongoing for more than a decade, and for it was itself the reaction of the century of brutal colonies rule, making violent death commonplace and they're easier to accept. The massacre was formed in the class of warfare, you see. In the former slaves, we were taking revenge against the former masters. And the fifth last, the war became racial conflict, pity the whites against blacks and mulattoes, which had racial hatred, dehumanization, and conspiracy theories all facilitated genocide. Dessalines came to the power after France's defeat and subsequently evacuated for that was previously known as Saint Domingo. In November 1803, the days of the Rumchunka forces surrendered. Dantès ordered executions of 800 French soldiers who had been left behind due to illness during the evacuation. He didn't guarantee the safety of the remaining white civil population. However, Jeremy Popkin writes that statement that's in such that there is still French on the island and still you consider yourselves free, spoke of a hostile attitude towards the remaining minority whites. Rumoring about the white population suggests that they would try to leave the country to convince foreigners' powers to invade and reintroduce slavery. Discussion between Dessalines and his advisories openly suggested that the white population should be put to death for sake of national security. Whites trying to leave Haiti were prevented from doing so. On January 1804, Dessalines proclaimed Haiti independent nation. Dessalines gave the order to all cities in Haiti that all whites should be put to death. The weapons should be silenced. Weapons such as knives and bayonets rather than gunfire, so that the killing could be done more quietly and avoid warning intended victims by the sound of gunfire and thereby giving them opportunities to escape. This is motherfucking deep. Come here and feel your play. During February and March, Dessalines traveled among the cities of Haiti to ensure himself that he was under orders that were carried out. Despite his orders, the massacre was often not carried out until he visited the cities in person. Of course, the massacre showed the almost identical pattern in every city he visited before he arrived there. He was only the few killings despite the orders of the Dessalines arrived. He spoke about the atrocities committed by former white authorities such as Rocaboom and Licoric after their demands, and he ordered that the mass killings in the area white population should be put into effect. Reportedly, he ordered the unwilling to take part of the killings, you see, especially men of mixed race, so that they blame should not be placed solely on the black population. Mass killings took place in the streets, in the place outside the cities. In parallel, The killings, plundering, and rape also occurred. Women and children were generally killed last. White women were often raped and pushed into the forced marriages under threat of death. Gasoline did not specifically mention this, that white women should be killed, and the soldiers were reportedly somewhat hesitant to do so. In the end, however, women were also put to death, though normally at the later stages of the massacre than the adult men. The argument for killing the women was that whites would truly be eradicated, with the white women in despair to giving them birth to new Frenchmen. Before his departure from the city, Dessalines would proclaim his amnesty and all that whites had survived and hidden during the massacre. When these people left their hidden places, however, most French were killed as well. Many whites were, however, hidden and smuggled out to sea by foreigners. However, there were notable exceptions, you see, to the ordered killings, and contingents of Polish defectors were given amnesty and granted Haitian citizenship for their renouncements of the French, allegiance and support of the Haitian independence. Dessalines referred to the Poles as the white Negroes of Europe and express of his solidarity and gratitude. In Porte-de French, only a few killings had occurred in the city despite the orders. After Dessalines arrived on the 18th of March, the number of killings escalated. According to the merchants' captains, about 800 people were killed in the city, while about 50 survived on 18/8/804. Dessalines arrived in Cape of Housson on a handful of killings had taken place. There had been a rival, but the killings escalated to the massacre on the streets, and outside the city was a rival. As elsewhere, the majority of the women were installed, not killing Dessalines' advisors. However, pointed out that Haiti, white Haitians would not disappear if the women were left to give birth to white men after here. This is Dessalines' orders that the women should be killed as well, with exceptions of those that agreed to marry non-white men. Sources created at the time stated that 3,000 people were killed in Cape of Haitian. Philippe Gordy writes that the figures were unrealistic, as the post-evacuation of French people's settlement had only been about 1,700 white people, we see. One of the most notorious of the massacre participants was John Zombie, a mulatto resident of the Port-au-Prince who was known for his brutality. One of the accounts describe how Zombie stumped a white man on the streets, stripped him naked, and took him to the stairs of the presidential palace, where he killed him with a dagger. Dessalines was reported among the spectators. He was said to be horrified by the episode. In Haitian voodoo tradition, the figure of Jean Zombie has become a prototype for the zombie. Aftermath effects in Haiti. By the end of 1804, some 3,000 to 5,000 people had been killed, and the white Haitians were practically eradicated, excluding a select group of whites who were given amnesty and spread consistent of the Polish ex-soldiers who were given Haitian citizenship to help Haitians black fight against white colonists. A small group of German colonists invited to the North region before the revolution of the group of medical doctors and professionals. Reportedly, also people with connections to officers in the Haitian army were spared, as well as the women who agreed to marry non-white men. Dessalines did not try to hide the massacre from the world, you see. In the official proclamation of 8 April 1804, you see, he stated he had given these true cannibals war for war crimes, for crime outrage, yes, I have saved my country, I have avenged America. He referred to the massacre as an act of national authority. Dessalines regarded the elimination of the white Haitians as an act of political necessity, as they were regarded as a threat to the peace between the black and the free people of color. It was also regarded as a necessary act of vengeance. Docilely, Secretary Broussard Tourney stated, "For the Declaration of Independence, we should have the skin of a white man for parchment, his skull for the ink, and his blood for the ink, the bayonet for the pen." Docilely was eager to assure that Haiti was not the threat to other nations. He directed efforts to establish friendly relationships also to nations where slavery was still allowed. In 1805 constitutions, all citizens were defined by black, and the Constitution was banned white men from owning land like that, except for people already born on the future for the white woman who were naturalized as Haitian citizens, and Germans and Poles who got Haitian citizenship. The massacre had long-lasted effect in the view of the Haitian Revolution. It helped to create a legacy of racial hostility in Haitian society. Garage writes in a book, Paradise Lost, that despite all Docilly's efforts and rationalizations that massacres were inexcusable, as they were foolish, traditional, historical. C.L.R. James occurred with a view in his breakthrough work. Black Jacobians write that the unfortunate country was ruined economically, its population lacking in social culture had its difficulties dubbed by this massacre. James wrote that the massacre was not publicly but revenge, and revenge was no place in politics. Gallipoli writes that the genocide was over Haitian white population was virtually non-existent. Citing Broussard's Nicholas Robbins and Adam Jones described the massacre as a genocide of the subaltern. In the previous disadvantaged group used a genocide to destroy their previous oppressors. The effect on American society. At the time of the U.S. Civil War, a major pretext for Southern whites, most whom did not own slaves, to support slave owners and ultimately fight for the Confederacy was fear of genocide similar to the Haitian massacre in 1804. The failed experiments in Haiti and Jamaica were implicitly referred to the Confederate discourse as the reason for secessionary. The slave revolt for the prominent themes in the discourse of Southern politic leaders and had influential U.S. politics opinions since the events took place. Historic Kevin C. Julius writes, as abolitionists loudly proclaim that all men are created equal, echoes of armed slavery, insurrections, and racial genocide sounded in Southern ears. Much of the recent towards the abolitionists can be seen as a reaction to the events in Haiti. In the run-up to the U.S. presidential elections of the 1860s, Roger B. Taney, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, wrote, I remember the horrors of St. Domingo, and said that the election will determine whether anything like this is to be visited upon our Southern countrymen. Abolitionists recognized the strength of this argument on the public opinion in both the North and the South. In correspondence to the New York Times in September 1861, during the war, the abolitionist named J.B. Lyon addressed the prominent argument of his opponent. We don't know any better than to imagine that emancipation would result in utterance of extinction. The civilization in the South, because the slaveholders and those in their interests have persistently told us that they also instance the horrors of the St. Domingo. Lyon also argued that the abolitionists of the slavery in the various Caribbean colonies of the European empires before 1860 showed that an end to slavery could be achieved peacefully.